She was a quiet virgin teacher until the millionaire whispered, "I want a child with you." Before we begin the story, don't forget to follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. Silas Prout drove west on Route 30 with the heater blowing cold and a dead man's toolbox rattling in the bed of his truck. And he was thinking, as he often did in January, that Ohio in winter was God's way of telling you something you already knew. The toolbox was Miller Fenn's, red Craftsman, the kind they used to make when the steel was real steel, gone orange-brown along the seams from 17 winters in an uninsulated garage. Miller had borrowed it the spring before he died, and Silas had let him keep it because that was the kind of thing you did for men who were already starting to look thin in the face. Now it was Silas's problem, same as the house was, same as the note on the property that Miller had let slide toward the end, and same, most days, as Cass. He turned off the state route onto the county road, and the truck's headlights swept across the flat white fields, and for a moment the world was nothing but light and frozen corn stubble, and then the darkness came back and it was just him again, moving through it. Cass Fenn was 31 years old and taught third grade at Millhaven Elementary, and had been Miller's wife for 6 of those years, and Silas had known her for 8. He did not let himself count the months. She was the kind of woman who left the porch light on when she was expecting someone and turned it off when she wasn't. And when Silas pulled into the drive that Thursday in January, the light was off, and he sat in the truck for a moment with the engine ticking, and looked at the dark window above the door. He had not called ahead, that was on him. He got out anyway and knocked, and after a while the light above came on and then the porch light, and then the door opened and Cass stood there in socked feet, and a flannel shirt that had been Miller's, gray and soft from 100 washes, and she looked at him the way you look at whether you weren't expecting. "Your truck make it okay," she said. "Heater's going out." "Come in then." The house smelled like something she'd baked, and also like the particular cold that gets into old Ohio farmhouses through the window frames and stays there from November to March. She had a fire going in the wood stove in the living room, and the kitchen light was the only other light, and it made the house feel like it was still deciding whether to be inhabited. "I brought the toolbox back," he said. "I know, I saw it in the bed." She was already at the stove, lifting the lid on something. "You hungry?" "I'm all right." "Sit down, Silas." He sat. There were drawings on the refrigerator. Joni's, Miller and Cass's daughter, who was 7 now and in 2nd grade and who had, for a period of about 4 months following her father's death, refused to draw people with faces. The drawings up now had faces. That seemed right. That seemed like something. Silas looked at them while Cass put food in front of him. Bean soup. Cornbread she'd wrapped in a dishcloth to keep warm. She set down a glass of water and didn't look at him while she did it, and her hand, when she pulled it back, grazed the back of his, and neither of them said anything about it. "Joni asleep," he said. "Hour ago." "She doing all right?" "She's doing." Cass sat down across from him with her own bowl. "She asked me last week if you were her dad now." Silas put his spoon down. "What you tell her?" "I told her you were her dad's best friend, and that was a different thing, but it was also a good thing." She looked at him. "Was that right?" "Yeah," he said, "that was right." He ate. Outside the wind came up and the old house shifted and settled the way old houses do, and Silas listened to it and thought about the 17 years he'd known Miller Fenn, which was long enough that Miller's absence still felt less like a death and more like a prolonged trip, a sense that he might walk through the back door any minute smelling like the shop, wiping his hands on a rag. 17 years was long enough that Silas sometimes forgot, in the middle of a thought about something else, that there was a difference now. He'd met Miller at 19, in the parking lot of a parts store in Millhaven, both of them reaching for the same fan belt in the bargain bin, and Miller had laughed and said, "You want it or you want me to arm wrestle you for it?" and Silas had said he could have it because Silas was the kind of person who gave things up before anyone could take them. That was how it started. Miller had taken it and also given Silas his number, and that had been the first time in Silas's life that someone had made the move toward him, and he had not known what to do with it except accept. He knew what he was. He'd always known. He was the kind of man who drove alone at 2 a.m. with the radio on a distant station and did not need to arrive anywhere in particular. He had an ease with solitude that he had always translated as self-sufficiency, the way you translate a word into a language you know better than the original. He had a house on 4 acres outside of town, and he kept it orderly and quiet, and when he went too long without speaking to anyone, he didn't notice until he noticed the quality of his own voice on the phone, cracked from disuse, and even then it didn't exactly bother him. Miller had bothered him. Miller had shown up at that house with a 12-pack and a problem with his carburetor and had stayed until 11 and come back the following Saturday. And at some point it had become the shape of things and Silas had let it become the shape of things and had not examined why except to think, occasionally, that it was convenient to have someone around who knew how to fix a furnace. Then there was Cass. He had not let himself think about Cass in any particular way because she was Miller's, and because Silas was not a man who took things that belonged to other men, and also because the wanting felt shameful in a way he couldn't fully articulate, a thing that lived in the same cold room as other things he didn't open the door to. He'd been friendly. He'd been decent. He'd helped her carry groceries when she was pregnant with Joni, and he'd sat in the waiting room while Miller paced, and when they brought Joni out, he'd looked at her and felt something move through him like current, some recognition he couldn't name. He'd been careful after that, more careful. Then Miller got sick, and being careful stopped being an option. Silas found out in March, 2 years ago now. Pancreatic, which the doctor said in a way that meant swift and without appeal, and Miller had nodded at that in the way he nodded at problems he'd already decided how to handle. He told Silas on a Tuesday in the shop, both of them under a Silverado, and when he said it, Silas had stayed under the truck for a moment staring up at the rusted frame, and then he'd rolled out and sat up and said, "Okay," and Miller had said, "Yeah." And they had not said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything else that would help. What followed was 11 months of the kind of time that reorganizes everything. Silas drove Miller to his appointments in Columbus when Cass couldn't get off work. He picked Joni up from school on the days Miller was bad and fed her grilled cheese and let her watch whatever she wanted on his television and drove her home when Cass got back. And Cass would come to the door looking scraped out and thin and say, "Thank you, Silas," and he would say, "No trouble," and that was all. He'd thought of it as simple. He'd thought of it as what you did. He had not thought about what it meant that he'd rearranged his entire life around this family without a single moment of deliberation, that he'd given up the Hartley contract because it would have kept him in Cleveland for 6 weeks during the wrong 6 weeks, that he'd eaten at that kitchen table so many nights that he knew which burner ran hot and which drawer the can opener was in, and the particular way the back door had to be lifted and pushed at the same time, or it wouldn't latch. He had not thought about any of that. He'd thought he was doing what needed doing. Miller died on a Wednesday in February, which Silas had always thought was a Miller kind of day to die, midweek, practical, no ceremony. After Silas had gone on coming, he'd told himself it was for Joni. Then he'd told himself it was because Cass needed help with the property. Then he'd stopped telling himself anything and just come, Thursdays mostly, sometimes Saturdays, and Cass left the porch light on when she was expecting him, and that was the shape of things. Now he ate her soup in her kitchen in January and the wind pressed against the old windows, and the toolbox was still in the bed of his truck, and he knew he'd brought it as an excuse, and also that no excuse was needed, and that the gap between those two things was the whole problem. "You're staring at the refrigerator," Cass said. "She's drawing with faces again." "Since October." "That's good." I know it's good. She tore a piece of cornbread. Dr. Elias says she's processing. I told her that's a lot of syllables for what 7-year-olds do, which is just keep going. She paused. She told me the same thing applies to adults. Silas looked at her. She giving you that advice or Joni? Both, I think. Cass looked at her bowl. She asked me if I was seeing anyone. The wood stove ticked. Out past the kitchen window the dark was solid and total the way rural Ohio dark gets after 10 at night, the nearest neighbor a half-mile of frozen field away. What you say, Silas said. I said no. She looked up at him then directly, the way she rarely did. Her eyes were gray, not blue the way he'd thought for years, but a gray that sometimes looked like water and sometimes looked like nothing in particular. I said there was someone I'd known a long time, but we were still figuring out what that meant. Silas held her look as long as he could, which was not very long. Cass. I know, she said. I know, Silas. And she got up and took his bowl even though it wasn't empty, and he let her, because that was also the shape of things. He drove home on the county road with the heater blowing cold and the toolbox still rattling in the bed, because he'd forgotten to unload it, or hadn't let himself, and the flat white fields went past in the headlights, and he thought about Miller Fenn, and felt the particular guilt of men who want what they should not want and have been good enough for long enough, that the wanting starts to feel like the last dishonest thing left. He thought she needs a man who can give her a second child. He thought she is 31 and there is still time. He thought Miller would have said something plain-spoken about this, something that cut through, and laughed at the end of it. He did not think any of this resolved anything. The pipe went in the second week of February, at 11 at night on a Thursday, and it was the bathroom pipe behind the wall that had always been bad and which he and Miller had talked about fixing in a way that never became doing. Cass called, and he could hear water in the background and Joni's voice high with the particular excitement of small children facing disasters they don't yet understand. He was there in 22 minutes. The water had come through the bathroom floor and into the hallway, and Joni was standing in the hallway in her socks holding her stuffed rabbit and saying, "It's okay, it's okay," in the same tone Cass used when she was talking Joni down from something. And Silas registered this only distantly because he was already moving, finding the main shutoff behind the water heater in the utility room, and when the water stopped he stood in the wet silence and heard the house drip. Silas. Cass was in the doorway of the utility room. She had wet socks and her hair was loose, which he almost never saw, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Find me a bucket," he said, "and towels, all of them." They worked for 2 hours. Joni stayed up past midnight sitting on the dry part of the hallway floor telling them about something that had happened at school, a substitute teacher who taught them a song about fractions, and Silas listened from inside the wall where he'd cut the drywall back to find the split pipe, and Cass moved around him passing things he needed without him asking, the way you do when you know the work. He was cold and wet to the elbows, and the copper was old, and he had to sweat 2 fittings by feel in the dark of the wall cavity. And when he was done, and the water was back on, and didn't leak, he sat on the wet bathroom floor for a minute and didn't move. Joni appeared in the doorway. "Is it fixed?" "It's fixed. Mom said you'd fix it." She regarded him with the serious appraisal of very young children assessing adults. "She said you always fix things." He didn't answer that. He got up. Cass had Joni in bed by 1. Silas was in the kitchen cleaning up when she came back down, and she came in and poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking and put one in front of him and sat across the table from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. He was bone cold, not from the February air but from 2 hours pressed against wet drywall in a house with the heat struggling, from the iron cold of old copper pipe on bare hands, from the particular exhaustion that comes when your body has worked past what you planned to give it. He wrapped both hands around the glass and felt the whiskey's warmth work up through his palms and into his wrists, and he thought that this was the cold he'd lived in for years. The managed, orderly cold of a man who kept things at arm's length and called it preference. And that this kitchen, even wet, even at 1 in the morning, was warmer than his house on 4 acres had been in a very long time. "I keep thinking I'm going to start handling things," Cass said, "and I keep not handling them. You handled tonight. I called you. That's handling it." She turned her glass on the table. "Miller used to say you were the most useful man he knew. He meant it as a compliment. I always thought it was a little sad." He wasn't wrong. "No," she looked at him, "but useful wasn't what I meant when I told Dr. Elias about you." He was looking at his hands, which were still dirty at the knuckles from the wall. "Cass, I need you to understand something." "Silas." "Let me," he looked up. "I've got 4 acres and a house that's paid off and work that's steady. I can't give you. I don't want anything given to me." Her voice was level, but underneath it was a wire pulled taut. "I have a house and a job. I'm not asking you to fix anything." The refrigerator hummed. The wood stove ticked. Under the floor, the house settled on its old foundation. "Then what are you asking?" he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, quiet enough that he had to be still to hear it, "I'm asking you to stop standing at the edge of this and come inside." He held that. Outside, a February wind moved across the field and pressed against the kitchen window, and the glass flexed almost imperceptibly in its old frame. And Silas heard in that small sound the whole architecture of what he had built his life to avoid. The exposure of a man who has come in from the cold and cannot pretend any longer that the cold suited him. "I'm afraid," he said. It was the most honest sentence he'd spoken in years, and it came out flat, the way honest sentences do. Cass didn't move toward him. She didn't soften her face or reach across the table. She said, "I know you are. I'm afraid of being a stand-in, of being the man who's here because the man who should be here isn't." She was quiet for long enough that the refrigerator cycled off, and the kitchen got quieter still. "Miller's been gone 14 months, she said. "You've been here for all 14 of them. There's a difference between filling a space and being a person, Silas. Joni knows it, I know it." She paused. "You're the one still deciding." He sat with that. The whiskey was gone and the glass was warm now from his hands, and he set it down and looked at the grain of the kitchen table, which was the table Miller had bought at an estate sale, and which still had a ring on one corner from a coffee cup that wasn't Cass's and wasn't Miller's, some stranger's mark from a stranger's life, and the table had absorbed it and become the table anyway. "I want that," he said, "a child with you. If that's I want that, not to replace anything because it's what comes next." He hadn't planned the words. They arrived the way things arrive after long cold, not with warmth exactly, but with the first sensation that warmth is possible. Cass looked at him across the kitchen table at 1 in the morning, with wet socks and her hair loose and her dead husband's flannel shirt soft on her shoulders, and she said, simply, "Okay." Not as a permission, not as a verdict, as a door opened from the inside. What he did then was reach across the table slowly with his dirty hand and put it over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. The kitchen dripped somewhere, the last of the water finding its way down through old wood, and neither of them moved for a long while. He drove home that night because it wasn't time yet, and he knew it wasn't time yet, and that knowing, the patience of it, the willingness to let a thing be what it was before asking it to be more, was perhaps the most different he had ever been from the man he'd spent 38 years constructing. He drove Route 30 at 2 a.m. with the radio on a distant station, the same drive he'd made 100 times, except that now the dark fields outside the window looked less like freedom and more like distance, and those were not the same thing, and he was only now learning to tell them apart. He did not sleep easily. He lay in the 4-acre house that was paid off and orderly and quiet, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about what it would mean to move through a morning that belonged to someone else's rhythm, to share a bathroom, to have a child's voice at 7 a.m. establish the tempo of the day. He thought about these things with the seriousness of a man inventorying what he stood to lose, and somewhere in that inventory, he understood that he was describing not loss but purchase, that you could not have the kitchen at 1 in the morning and also the 4 acres of silence, and that, for the first time in his adult life, the silence was the lesser thing. He thought Miller would have said he took long enough. He thought Miller would not have been wrong. Spring came slow that year, the way Ohio springs come, grudgingly, the frost retreating inches at a time, and the field still brown into April. Silas moved his things in stages, a box here, a drawer there, testing each step before committing weight. He felt the strangeness of it every morning, the different quality of light through east-facing windows, the sound of the school bus before he was fully awake, Joni's footsteps overhead on the days she woke before them both. He kept waiting to feel like an interloper. He kept not feeling it. What he felt instead was something so close to ordinary that it alarmed him. There was no name for it that didn't sound like sentimentality. It was the particular warmth of a kitchen in early morning. It was Cass handing him a coffee cup and saying, "You're out of the bathroom by 6:30. That's hours," and the hours landing in him like a nail finding wood. In April, on a Thursday, Joni came in from school and put her backpack down in the mudroom and said, without preamble, "I told Tyler Marsh you were my dad. He said you weren't really. I said he didn't know what he was talking about." She went to the refrigerator for a juice box. Silas was at the kitchen table. He looked at the back of her head, at the 2 braids Cass had put in that morning, and he thought of Miller Fenn, of the parking lot of the parts store 19 years ago, of the way Miller had laughed and held out his hand. "Take it if you need it more than me." He had been talking about a fan belt. He had not only been talking about a fan belt. "Tyler Marsh doesn't know what he's talking about," Silas said. Joni nodded, satisfied. "That's what I said." May came and the fields went green, and the county road showed its gravel through the last of the snowmelt, and one Saturday morning Silas drove it with the windows down and the heater off and the air still cold enough at speed to be something against his face. The conversation about the child had not been a single conversation. It had been several, spread across weeks, conducted mostly sideways in the car, doing dishes, once in the hardware store in town where Cass had picked up a can of the wrong paint, and they'd stood in the aisle for 10 minutes deciding whether to go back. They had talked around the fear of it, and inside the fear of it, and Cass had said once, quietly, that she wasn't asking him to be Miller. She was asking him to be whoever he was, and that she'd spent enough time with whoever he was to think that was enough. He had not said much in response to that. He had put the can of wrong paint back on the shelf and found the right one and handed it to her, and she had taken it, and they had walked to the register. He understood by then that this was what love looked like when it came in through the back rather than the front. Not declared, not arrived at by any single threshold, but accumulated in hardware stores and wrong paint cans and pipe fittings sweated in the dark by feel. That evening he went to the garage for a shop light and found the pull-string bulb already on. For a moment, standing in the doorway, he felt the full presence of Miller Fenn, not the ghost of him, not anything supernatural, just the accumulated sensory fact of the man. The diesel smell, the particular way the garage held cold even in May, the layout of the workbench which was Miller's layout and which Silas had not changed. He stood there long enough for the feeling to finish. Then he went in and saw the toolbox on the floor in the corner where he'd left it, still pushed against the wall, never found its shelf. He carried it to the workbench by the rusted handle, and the rust came off on his palm, orange red as old iron, and he set it down and opened the lid. Miller's things were inside, ordered the way Miller ordered his things. The right socket in the right slot, the tape measure rolled tight, the spare fuses in their labeled plastic case, Under everything, folded once, a piece of paper. He unfolded it. Miller's handwriting, all caps, a contractor's hand, built for job sites rather than pages. A list of things he'd been meaning to fix at the house. The bathroom pipe was on it near the top. Silas had gotten to about half of them. Below the list, added in different ink, the letters slightly larger. Tell Silas he won't figure it out. The list ended there. No object, no instruction, just Miller's faith or Miller's impatience or both. The man's whole character compressed into the assumption that whatever needed saying would be obvious to anyone paying attention. Silas stood at the workbench for a while. He felt no resolution. He felt something quieter than that, the sense of a long joke whose punchline had arrived years after the setup, and the joke was on him, and it was also not unkind. The right thing that moved through him might have been grief or might have been gratitude, and he had learned, by now, that with Miller those two things had always run in the same channel. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He found a place for the toolbox on the second shelf between the shop light and a coffee can of miscellaneous hardware pressed back against the wall with the handle facing out. He stood back and looked at it there. The rust was still the rust. The dents were still the dents, but it was off the floor now, which was something. It was in its place. He turned the light off. The house was lit from the inside against the May evening, warm-windowed in the blue dusk the way houses look when they're inhabited and mean to stay that way. Through the kitchen window Cass was at the sink. The light above was on. Her hands were in the water and she was looking at something outside the window or at her own reflection. And then she looked up and saw him coming across the yard, and she lifted one wet hand and held it there. Not quite a wave, not quite a greeting, something that didn't have a name for the fact of his return being expected, being unremarkable, being the shape of things. He put his hand on the door and lifted and pushed at the same time, the way it needed, and the latch caught.